Hi guys, tonight we're going back to the spring of 1940, to the narrow beaches of Dunkirk, where tens of thousands of British soldiers found themselves trapped between the sea and the advancing German army. You might have heard of the miracle evacuation, but for the men on the sand, it was less of a miracle and more of a nightmare. This is a story of exhaustion, fear, and the quiet moments that made survival feel almost impossible. Let's begin our slow journey through one of Britain's darkest weeks. But before we begin, if you're someone who loves slow, curious dives into forgotten worlds, tap the like button, subscribe, and let me know in the comments where you're watching from. I'd love to get to know my viewers better. The morning air was damp, carrying with it the distant thud of artillery that seemed to roll endlessly across the flat French countryside, and every man along the dunes knew that the sound meant the enemy was getting closer. They had been retreating for days, moving through towns that smelled of smoke and rubble, dodging both the shells from above and the panic that spread faster than any rumor. Dunkirk itself was not a place they had planned to reach. It was simply the last piece of ground left to hold on to, a thin strip of sand pressed between the cold waters of the Channel and the tightening noose of the German forces. For many of the soldiers, the sea was an unfamiliar kind of enemy. It looked calm, but it was a wall they could not pass without ships, and ships were few, scattered, and under constant attack. The men dug shallow scrapes in the sand, crouching low as aircraft growled overhead, and every dive of a Stuka felt like it could be the end of the line. Yet in the pauses between the raids, there was an eerie stillness, just the sound of boots shifting on wet sand, the shuffle of men who had nothing to do but wait. Hunger was already setting in, as supply lines had long since broken, and water was rationed in sips, each man holding onto his bottle like a last anchor to normal life. Letters from home, crumpled and damp, were read and reread until the ink smudged, as if clinging to the voices in those words could block out the crash of bombs or the distant gunfire that never seemed to stop. Some tried to sleep, using their packs as pillows, but sleep was thin and restless, broken by sudden shouts or the thud of something hitting too close. The beach seemed endless, a flat and open prison, and the horizon where the sky met the sea felt like the only way out, but it was a horizon filled with uncertainty. The men didn't know if rescue was coming, or if they would be left to fend for themselves, to face capture or worse. The smell of oil hung in the air, carried from burning wrecks in the harbor, and the water itself shimmered with a thin film of fuel. Every hour felt longer than the last, and each moment was weighed down by the knowledge that they were running out of time. Some soldiers kept their rifles close, as if expecting a sudden push from the dunes, while others stared out to sea, hoping for the faint silhouette of a ship to appear. But for now there was only the slow passage of minutes, and the low rumble of war, moving ever closer. The nightmare was not just the danger, it was the waiting, the helplessness, and the gnawing thought that the escape they needed might never come. The second day on the beach began with a gray, heavy sky that seemed to press down on everything, muting the colors until the sand, the sea, and the horizon all blended into the same dull shade. The soldiers woke not because they had rested, but because rest had become impossible. The night had been filled with distant flashes and the dull thump of explosions somewhere inland, each one carrying the thought that the enemy was closing the circle around them. Along the dunes, men were scattered in small clusters, some crouched low, speaking in hushed voices, others simply staring ahead, caught in their own thoughts. Dunkirk was not the bustling port they might have imagined. It was a place stripped bare by retreat and bombardment, where half-sunken ships leaned drunkenly in the shallows, and the piers were blackened skeletons of what they once were. The smell was a mix of salt water, smoke, and something acrid that burned the nose, perhaps from burning oil, or the ruins smoldering in the town behind them. From time to time, aircraft engines droned high above, and heads instinctively tilted upward, scanning the clouds for the dark shapes of bombers, or the sharp, predatory silhouettes of fighters. Each time they appeared, the reaction was the same, a sudden, sharp call. Men dropping flat against the sand, the heartbeat of the beach quickening as they waited to hear if the bombs were meant for them. The explosions came without warning, kicking up fountains of sand and shrapnel that hissed through the air, leaving behind craters and silence. Between raids, the soldiers tried to keep themselves busy, though there was little to do but tend to weapons, share the last scraps of rations, or wander aimlessly toward the tide and back. Some collected bits of wood or debris, piling them into makeshift windbreaks, to shield themselves from the cold gusts that swept across the open shoreline. Others sat with their knees drawn up, scribbling in small notebooks or on scraps of paper, writing letters that might never be delivered, sealing them with the quiet hope that someone, someday, would read them. The water's edge was deceptive. It looked calm, but just beyond the shallows the waves were choppy, and the wind carried the chill of early summer seas. Ships, when they did appear, were never enough. A small destroyer or a fishing boat might arrive, load as many as it could carry, and vanish into the haze, leaving hundreds still waiting their turn. Rumors spread quickly, faster than the truth, each man passing along fragments of what he had heard. That the Navy was coming in force, that the Germans were just miles away, that there would be no more ships after tomorrow. The uncertainty gnawed at them more than hunger or thirst, because it was the kind of worry that never ended, the kind that could not be shot at or hidden from. The officers moved among their men, offering quiet words, trying to keep order, but even their faces were drawn tight with fatigue. As the day dragged on, the tide pulled back, revealing more of the flat, wet sand, dotted with wreckage, twisted metal, splintered wood, and the dark shadows of things best not looked at too closely. The sun broke through for a moment in the late afternoon, turning the sea to silver, and for a heartbeat it almost looked peaceful. But the illusion didn't last. The low hum of engines returned, and soon the air was alive with the rising scream of another dive, another burst of fire, another reminder that this beach was no sanctuary. When night finally crept in, it brought no safety, only a different kind of danger, the fear of an unseen approach, and the knowledge that the darkness could hide friend or foe alike. The men huddled in small groups, speaking softly or not at all, and the cold seeped into their bones as they watched the dark horizon, hoping for the faint light of a ship that might carry them home. Dawn on the third day broke without warmth, the pale light revealing the same endless stretch of sand that had become both a refuge and a trap. The tide was higher now, pushing the waterline closer to the men huddled along the dunes, and with it came the low groan of waves dragging against the wreckage scattered across the shallows. Every soldier woke stiff and sore, wrapped in the dampness that came from sleeping under the open sky. Their uniforms were stiff with dried salt and sand, boots heavy from constant wetting, and there was no real way to get warm except to keep moving. Still, movement was dangerous. Every step across the open beach risked catching the attention of an enemy pilot or sniper somewhere in the ruins beyond. The town itself was a place no one wanted to linger. Buildings leaned awkwardly, their walls split and their windows shattered. Streets blocked with rubble, and the remains of what had once been a bustling port. Here and there, fires smoldered, sending up thin pillars of smoke that marked them like beacons for anyone watching from above. The men knew the Germans were out there, just beyond the reach of sight. Their advance slowed but never stopped. Patrols returning from the edges of the perimeter brought back quiet reports of skirmishes. Shots traded in narrow streets, shadows moving in the fog. The sense that the enemy was feeling for any weakness in the defenses. On the beach the tension was constant. Aircraft could appear at any moment, the thump of distant artillery serving as a steady reminder that this was no safe ground. During the quiet hours, some soldiers took to digging shallow trenches, or scooping out depressions in the sand, anything to feel less exposed. Others simply sat and watched the sea, trying to guess when and where the next ship might appear. The lucky few who had boarded vessels the previous day had vanished into the haze toward England, leaving the rest to wait and wonder if their turn would come. And when a ship did appear, whether a Navy destroyer or a small civilian craft, the scramble to reach it was both desperate and disciplined. Lines formed quickly, men moving in silence, each one acutely aware that space was limited, and that the moment the ship was full, it would be gone. The sound of boots on wooden planks, the sharp commands from officers, the slap of waves against hulls. All of it was over in minutes, leaving behind the emptiness of the beach once more. Food had grown scarcer still, rations were down to the smallest portions, and many men had gone a day or more without a proper meal. Water was precious, and those with even a half-full canteen guarded it carefully. Thirst was a quiet enemy, gnawing away at strength without the drama of bombs or bullets, and it made every movement slower, every thought heavier. The mood shifted between grim determination and quiet resignation. Some men spoke of home, of pubs and family dinners, of the simple act of sleeping in a bed. Others refused to speak at all, as if talking about such things would make the distance from them unbearable. There were moments when hope surged, a sudden report of more ships on the way, or a rumor that the Germans had paused their advance, but hope was fragile here, easily shattered by the next air raid, or the sight of smoke rising in the distance. As the day wore on, the heat of the sun became another burden, the open beach offering no shade, and helmets grew hot to the touch. Some men removed theirs for relief, only to jam them back on at the sound of approaching aircraft. Evening came slowly, the light stretching long shadows across the sand, and the wind picked up, carrying with it the salt of the sea and the faint, bitter scent of oil fires. In the dimming light, men prepared for another night of waiting, each one knowing that every hour they remained here was another roll of the dice. Some would be gone by morning, ferried across the channel under cover of darkness. Others would wake to the same sight as today, the sand, the sea, and the distant line of the horizon, still out of reach. The fourth day brought with it a dull, oppressive heat that settled over Dunkirk like a heavy blanket, slowing every movement and making the air itself feel thick. The early morning haze blurred the horizon, making it hard to tell where the sea ended and the sky began, and for a brief moment the world seemed muted, as if holding its breath. But the stillness never lasted long here. By mid-morning, the familiar drone of engines rose over the water, and every man on the beach felt it first in his chest before hearing it with his ears, a low vibration that promised nothing good. Dark specks appeared far out to sea, growing larger until the shapes of enemy aircraft took form against the pale sky. The warning calls went up, sharp and urgent, and men dropped to the sand, pressing themselves flat, as shadows raced over them. The dive bombers came screaming down, their sirens cutting through the air like something alive, followed by the cracking roar of explosions. Sand and smoke erupted in violent bursts, and shrapnel hissed through the air, biting into whatever it struck. The attack lasted minutes, but left behind the kind of silence that made the hairs on the back of the neck stand up. Soldiers pushed themselves up slowly, brushing sand from their faces, eyes scanning for friends, for damage, for the next wave. Those who had been closest to the impacts moved with the dull, mechanical motions of men who were too tired to be startled anymore. A few fires burned in the distance, thin smoke twisting into the breeze. Beyond the wreckage of the piers, the sea had claimed more debris. A lifeboat split in two, its bright paint scorched, drifting lazily in the tide. It was during these lulls that the strangeness of Dunkirk really set in. This was war, but it was not the war most had imagined. There was no steady advance, no charging into enemy fire. It was waiting, always waiting, for a chance to leave, for a target to appear, for orders that might never come. The men's world had narrowed to the beach, and the shallow edge of the sea, to the sound of waves and the constant background hum of danger. Every hour was spent in a kind of suspended tension, long stretches of stillness interrupted by moments of frantic motion, as if the entire place existed on a thin thread that could snap at any moment. Ships came and went, some bringing supplies, most taking away the lucky few who had been chosen to go next. Watching them depart was a mix of relief and longing, relief that some had made it out, and longing to be one of them. Those left behind returned to their dugouts in the sand or sat along the dunes, rifles across their knees, scanning the skies. The hunger was becoming harder to ignore now. Rations were so scarce that some men went without entirely. saving what little they had for another day. Water was worse. Canteens were passed around sparingly, men taking only the smallest sips. Conversations grew shorter, voices hoarser. The dryness in the throat was a constant companion, a quiet misery that made every word feel heavier. The town behind the beach was changing too. Each day brought new damage from air raids, and patrols returning from the ruins spoke of streets collapsing into rubble, of doors swinging loose from their hinges, of the eerie sight of abandoned shopfronts with goods still in the windows, untouched except for the dust that settled over them. There was a ghostly emptiness to it all, as if the place had been frozen mid-breath and left to crumble in silence. Nightfall brought little comfort. If anything, it was worse. Darkness hid the dangers but also stripped away the small illusions of safety daylight offered. The temperature dropped sharply, and the cold bit into every exposed inch of skin. Men wrapped themselves in whatever they could, pulling coats tight, huddling together for warmth, the sand beneath them radiating back the day's heat for only a short while before becoming as cold as the air above. Somewhere far out to sea, the faint lights of ships moved slowly toward England, and those still waiting imagined the sound of their engines, the feel of a deck beneath their boots, the sight of the white cliffs rising ahead. But for now, all they had was the sound of the tide, and the quiet breathing of the men beside them, each lost in his own thoughts of how much longer this nightmare would last. By the fifth day, Dunkirk no longer felt like a place that belonged to the living. The beach had become a strange, shifting camp. Rows of men scattered along the dunes, their faces drawn and pale, eyes shadowed from too many nights without sleep. The air carried the mingled scents of salt, smoke, and unwashed bodies, a constant reminder of how long they had been here. Every hour seemed to stretch further than the last, the waiting thick and heavy, broken only by sudden bursts of chaos when the enemy appeared overhead. The town behind them was now little more than a hollow shell. Streets that once bustled with fishermen and shopkeepers were silent, their buildings fractured and blackened from repeated bombardment. Occasionally, a patrol would move cautiously through the ruins, searching for supplies or stragglers, but most avoided the place unless ordered. There was something unsettling about those empty streets, the way a door might creak in the wind, or a loose shutter slam suddenly against a wall, as if the town itself were restless. Out on the water, the channel was deceptively calm, its surface broken only by the slow rise and fall of waves. Ships still came, though not nearly enough. Some were naval destroyers, sleek and fast, able to carry hundreds. Others were fishing boats or pleasure craft, small and crowded, their decks packed with men in muddy uniforms. Watching them load was like watching a lifeline being pulled slowly away. Every man who boarded was one fewer left to endure the uncertainty here. And yet, there was no bitterness among those still waiting, only the quiet understanding that someone had to be last. The Germans had not pressed forward in full force yet, but the sense of being surrounded grew stronger with each passing hour. There were moments when the distant thud of artillery rolled across the sand, followed by the faint, unnatural stillness that came after. The officers kept their men moving when they could, assigning tasks, digging, carrying, patrolling, not because it was strictly necessary, but because standing idle left too much room for thoughts to turn dark. Food was nearly gone. Many men carried nothing more than a biscuit or two in their pockets, saving them for as long as possible, nibbling at the edges like it might stretch the taste. Water was a more urgent problem. Canteens were light, and each sip was measured, swallowed slowly to make it last. The dry ache in the mouth and throat was becoming part of life here, something they barely spoke of anymore. By late afternoon, the wind had shifted, carrying with it the deep hum of engines far out to sea. Men rose to their feet, scanning the horizon. Slowly, shapes emerged from the haze. Several ships, larger than usual, moving steadily toward the beach. A ripple of movement passed through the waiting soldiers as word spread. Those whose turn had come moved quickly but without panic, lining up in silence. The boarding took place under constant tension. The ships were vulnerable here, and everyone knew it. Indeed, before the last men could climb aboard, the sound of aircraft engines cut through the air. Heads snapped upward, eyes narrowing against the glare. Bombers appeared, small black crosses against the blue, growing larger with each second. Orders were shouted. Some men scrambled to the dunes. Others crouched low near the water's edge. The attack was sharp and fast, bombs splashing into the shallows, geysers of water drenching those nearby, smoke rising from a vessel struck at the stern. Still, the ships managed to pull away, engines roaring, as they turned toward the safety of the open sea. Those left behind watched them go, a mix of relief and dread in their chests. Relief that some had escaped, dread that the beach felt emptier now, the waiting longer. Night came quietly, without fanfare. The stars were hidden behind a low bank of clouds, and the darkness was thick. Men lay close to the ground, rifles beside them, listening to the distant sounds of engines and the faint rush of the tide. In that stillness it was easy to imagine home. Warm kitchens, the sound of laughter, the feeling of clean sheets. But the crash of a wave or the groan of a shifting wreck would bring them back, to the sand, the cold, and the endless uncertainty of whether tomorrow would be their turn to leave, or the day the enemy came. By the 6th day, the beach had started to feel smaller. Not because the sand had changed, but because the men were running out of places to go. The tide shifted with the same steady rhythm, yet each retreat left behind more wreckage, broken lifeboats, splintered crates, and the occasional dark, unspoken shape that the waves pulled in and out. The soldiers no longer flinched at these sights. They had seen enough to know that Dunkirk would take whatever the sea returned, and add it to its growing graveyard. The heat during the day was stifling, the air heavy with the smell of smoke and oil. The wrecks in the harbor continued to smolder, their twisted steel frames standing out against the pale water. The sound of gulls, once a reminder of home, now seemed harsh and unwelcome, their cries mixing with the distant rumble of artillery. The Germans had tightened their control inland. Patrols reported that every road toward Dunkirk was either blocked or under fire, and no one doubted that the enemy could sweep down at any time. Still, the main assault never came, and the delay became its own form of torment, like a predator circling its prey, waiting for the perfect moment. Ships continued to arrive, but they never stayed long. The moment their ramps touched sand, the loading began, men moving with silent urgency, boots thudding against wet wood. The process had become almost mechanical. Line up, board quickly, keep your head down. But there were never enough spaces, and those left behind simply stepped back, their eyes fixed on the receding shape of the ship, until it vanished into the haze. Hunger had settled into a dull, constant ache. What little food remained was hoarded, shared only in the smallest bites. The men's uniforms hung looser on their frames, belts tightened another notch. Thirst was worse. Water was rationed so strictly that some went half a day without a drink, their lips cracking, their tongues dry. Even the sea breeze offered no relief. It only reminded them how undrinkable the water before them was. The beach itself had taken on a strange rhythm. In the quiet hours, men would sit in small groups, speaking in low tones, or not speaking at all. Some wrote letters they knew might never be delivered. Others simply stared at the sea, as if they could will a ship to appear. When the air raid sirens came, or when there was no time for sirens at all, the mood shifted instantly. Dive bombers swept in low, their engines howling, the sand exploding into clouds under their bombs. Men threw themselves flat, helmets pressed into the grit, waiting for the scream of the dive to end, for the sharp crack of detonation to pass. And then, as quickly as it began, the raid would be over, leaving behind the sound of waves and the smell of cordite. The officers kept order as best they could, moving through the men with steady voices, checking positions, offering what reassurance they could. But the truth was plain in their eyes. No one knew how much longer they could hold this fragile foothold. The enemy's artillery was creeping closer. its reports now loud enough to be felt in the chest. By late afternoon, the wind shifted, and a faint mist rolled in from the sea. It blurred the horizon, hiding the water's edge, and for a brief while it felt like the beach existed outside of time. Men moved more slowly in the haze, their shapes ghostly, their voices muted. Some took the chance to rest, others worked quietly, repairing dugouts or shifting debris to create better cover. As night fell, the mist deepened, and visibility dropped to almost nothing. The darkness brought its own dangers, sudden movements in the shadows, the constant fear of an unexpected push from inland. Yet there was also a thin thread of hope that the cover might bring more ships in under darkness. Men lay close together in the dunes, listening for the sound of engines out on the water, each one silently willing that sound to come closer. Somewhere beyond the fog, the channel stretched toward home, and in the cold night air, that thought was the only warmth they had. The seventh day began under a pale, washed-out sky, the kind that seemed to drain all color from the world. The sun was nothing more than a faint glow behind thin clouds, offering neither warmth nor comfort. The tide had pulled back in the early hours, leaving long stretches of wet sand that reflected the dull light like tarnished glass. Scattered across it were the remnants of the previous days, splintered beams, fragments of canvas, and twisted scraps of metal that had once been parts of boats. The men moved slowly in the morning, their bodies worn down by the endless cycle of waiting, scrambling for cover, and returning to wait again. There was no true rest here. Even in moments of stillness, the mind never relaxed, always listening for the drone of engines or the crack of gunfire. The beach had taken on the look of a settlement built from nothing. Small dugouts carved into the dunes, makeshift shelters of driftwood and torn tarps, footprints overlapping in the sand like the marks of a tide that never retreated. The men had grown quieter. Conversations, when they happened, were short and practical. Much of the time they communicated with glances or small gestures. They didn't need to explain the hunger, the thirst, the fear. Those were shared burdens, understood without words. The few rations that remained were carefully divided. The smallest bites stretched into something like a meal. Some men had gone 2 days with almost nothing, their strength fading, their uniforms hanging loose. Water was sipped in silence, each swallow deliberate. Late in the morning, a shout went up from the far end of the beach. Men turned toward the water, where the faint outline of several ships was visible through the haze. Word spread quickly. Another evacuation was underway. Lines formed without pushing or shouting. The urgency was there, but it was controlled, each man knowing that chaos could cost lives. As the ships drew closer, the sound of their engines mixed with the hiss of the tide, and for a moment it almost felt like the sound of hope. But hope here was always fragile. Before the first boat had even touched the sand, the low growl of aircraft engines rolled in from the west. Heads tilted upward, eyes narrowing, and the sharp whine of diving bombers cut through the air. The beach erupted into motion. Men dropping to the sand, others scrambling for what little cover there was. Explosions ripped through the shoreline, throwing sand high into the air, the concussions rattling teeth and making ears ring. One of the smaller ships took a direct hit, the blast splitting it apart, sending smoke and fire curling into the sky. Still, the evacuation continued. Under the cover of returning fire from ships offshore, men climbed aboard as quickly as they could, their boots clanging on metal, hands gripping railings slick with seawater. Those left behind watched in silence as the vessels pulled away, their decks crowded with dark figures, until they disappeared into the mist. When the noise faded, the beach returned to its uneasy quiet. The men moved slowly, checking for wounded, pulling debris away from the shallows. Some sat with their backs to the dunes, heads resting on their knees, as if willing their bodies to disappear into the sand. Afternoon brought a brief break in the clouds, a thin strip of blue opening above the horizon. It was almost cruel, too small to be real relief, yet enough to remind them of the world beyond Dunkirk. A few men stared at it for a long time, as if trying to memorize the sight. Evening came with a sharp wind from the north, the kind that cut through even the thickest coats. Fires were lit in shallow pits, their light barely reaching beyond the dunes. The men spoke little, the flicker of the flames casting long, wavering shadows across their faces. Beyond the reach of the firelight, the sea moved in its endless rhythm, each wave carrying with it the sound of something vast and indifferent. Somewhere in that darkness were the ships that might return tomorrow, or might not. The only thing certain was that the waiting would continue. By the 8th day, the men had stopped trying to keep track of time in any normal way. Watches still ticked, but the days blurred together into the same rhythm of waiting, scrambling, and waiting again. The beach looked different each morning, not because anything truly changed, but because the tide and the bombs kept rearranging it, carving new craters in the sand, scattering debris into fresh patterns. The town behind them had almost ceased to exist as a place. The few standing buildings were nothing more than empty shells, their windows blown out, their walls pitted with shrapnel. Once in a while, a patrol would return from the ruins carrying a small prize, a half-full water container, a handful of canned goods, a blanket. But such finds were rare, and never enough for everyone. Hunger had become a constant companion. The ache in their stomachs no longer came in waves. It was simply there, dull and steady, making limbs heavier, thoughts slower. Water was rationed more strictly than ever, measured in swallows, each man knowing his next drink might be hours away. Even the thought of home was starting to feel distant, as if England were not across the channel, but in some other world entirely. In the late morning, the sound of ship engines carried faintly across the water. Men looked toward the horizon and saw the outlines of several vessels moving in. It was a sight that always brought a flicker of hope, no matter how many times it had been dashed before. They began to form lines, quiet and orderly, as if afraid to draw attention to themselves. But almost on cue, the low, menacing hum of aircraft rolled in from inland. The ships were still minutes from reaching shore when the first bombs fell. Columns of sand and smoke shot skyward, the air filled with the crack of explosions and the whistle of falling steel. Men dove for cover, pressing themselves into the dunes, or crouching in shallow holes scooped into the beach. One of the ships, a small civilian craft, took a near miss. The blast rocked it violently, but it stayed afloat and kept moving. The attack passed quickly, but its mark was left on the beach. Another set of craters, another layer of smoke drifting over the tide. When the ships finally reached shore, they loaded as many as they could, working with speed and silence. The ramps rattled under boots, the creak of mooring ropes loud in the still air. Then, as soon as they were full, the vessels turned back toward the haze over the channel, leaving the rest to wait their turn. The afternoon brought a chill wind, sharp enough to sting the face. Men pulled their coats tighter, some huddling together in small groups for warmth. The air smelled of brine and smoke, and the distant horizon seemed as empty as it had that first morning. Night fell without warning, the clouds smothering what little light the moon might have offered. Fires burned low in shallow pits, their glow barely reaching beyond the nearest figures. Conversations were hushed, if they happened at all. In the darkness, every sound seemed closer. The sigh of the tide, the faint creak of a distant hull, the soft scuff of boots shifting in the sand. Somewhere out there, ships might be coming. Or they might not. And until that answer arrived, the men lay in the cold, waiting for the dawn and whatever it would bring. The 9th day began under a sky the color of ash, the sun hidden somewhere behind a thick layer of cloud that seemed unwilling to break. The dampness in the air clung to everything. Uniforms, weapons, even the sand itself felt heavy with it. The tide was high in the morning, pushing the waterline almost to the dunes, and with it came more debris, a shattered dinghy. Crates burst open to spill their contents of twisted metal, and the blackened remains of what might once have been a small boat's engine. The men moved with a sluggishness that wasn't laziness but exhaustion, the kind that came from too many days with too little food, too little water, and no certainty of what tomorrow would bring. The enemy's artillery had drawn closer overnight. The dull thud of shells landing somewhere inland was now joined by the sharper, nearer cracks of impacts just beyond the town. Patrols reported that the Germans had pushed forward again, tightening the noose, and the knowledge sat like a stone in every stomach. Still, the assault hadn't come directly. It was as if the enemy was content to let the air raids and the hunger do the work for them. Late in the morning, a line of ships appeared far out to sea, larger than usual, their shapes just visible through the haze. Word spread quickly, but it was tinged with caution. No one moved until the vessels were close enough to be sure they weren't a mirage brought on by tired eyes. When they were finally close enough to see their details, the grey paint, the movement of figures on deck, men began to form lines. The process was almost ritual now. Stand in silence, move when told, keep your eyes forward. The loading began swiftly, boots clanging on ramps, voices low and urgent. For a brief stretch it seemed as though this evacuation might happen without interruption. But Dunkirk never allowed such illusions for long. The sound of aircraft engines came from the east, a swarm of low, throaty growls that made every head turn skyward. The bombers came fast, diving low over the beach. Explosions threw sand high into the air, smoke rising in thick columns that twisted in the wind. One of the larger ships took a hit near its bow, rocking violently before managing to pull away. Still, most of the vessels managed to take on their loads and slip back into the channel, vanishing into the mist. Those left behind returned to their shallow shelters, the taste of smoke still in their mouths. The rest of the day passed in a tense quiet, broken only by the occasional distant blast or the faint crack of rifle fire from somewhere beyond the ruins. The hunger was sharper now, gnawing in the background of every thought. Men spoke less, conserving their energy, their eyes half-lidded with fatigue. As evening came, the wind picked up, rattling loose bits of debris, and carrying with it the sharp, metallic tang of burning fuel. Fires flickered in the distance where the town met the beach, their light dancing against the low clouds. In the darkness, the beach became a place of shadows and silhouettes, every shape potentially friend or foe. Men lay with their rifles close, listening to the steady rush of the tide, and the occasional muffled shout from somewhere down the shoreline. Above all, they listened for the sound that meant hope, the slow, steady thrum of ship engines coming to take them away. But that sound didn't come tonight. Instead, they drifted into a restless half-sleep, knowing that dawn would bring another day exactly like this one, unless fate decided otherwise. The 10th day began with the sea as flat as glass, the surface reflecting the low, heavy clouds that hung over the channel. The stillness was unsettling. It made every small sound, a cough, the creak of leather straps, the rattle of loose gear, seemed sharper, almost too loud against the silence. The tide was out, revealing a wide stretch of wet sand littered with jagged debris. Men moved slowly across it, their boots leaving dark prints that quickly filled with water. The air was damp, and the faint scent of smoke drifted from the ruins behind the beach. It was the smell of a place that had been fought over too long. The town was little more than rubble now. Patrols reported that the main streets were blocked with collapsed walls, and fires still smoldered in places where fuel or timber had caught days earlier. The enemy was close. Close enough that some claimed to have seen movement in the far streets, shadows slipping between broken doorways. The artillery thuds were nearer than ever, the sound rolling across the flat ground and echoing against the dunes. In the morning hours there was no sign of ships. The men waited anyway, watching the horizon with the same hollow patience they had developed over the past days. Some sat in their dugouts sharpening bayonets or wiping down rifles. Others lay flat on their backs, eyes closed, as if pretending they were somewhere else. Hunger gnawed at them constantly. The rations had run so low that some men carried nothing at all in their pockets, relying on whatever might be handed out by an officer during the day. Water was worse. Many had gone since yesterday without a sip, their lips dry and cracked, their voices rough. Midday brought a break in the quiet, a faint vibration in the air, followed by the distant shapes of ships pushing through the haze. Word spread quickly, but it was muted, as though no one wanted to speak too loudly and risk drawing bad luck. The vessels moved in carefully, their grey hulls cutting through the pale water. Lines formed quickly, the men ready to move at the first signal. But before the ramps could drop, the now familiar sound of aircraft rolled in from the west. Bombers appeared overhead, their dark silhouettes momentarily blotting out the pale sky. The attack was sudden and brutal. Sand exploded in plumes, shrapnel whined through the air, and the sharp tang of burning fuel filled the lungs. One of the destroyers was struck near the stern, its deck engulfed in smoke, but it stayed afloat long enough to back away from the shore. In the chaos, the loading continued. Men climbed aboard as fast as they could, boots slipping on wet planks, hands gripping whatever they could find. Then, just as quickly, the ships were gone, pulling away into the mist. Those who remained returned to the dunes, some lying flat to catch their breath, others scanning the sky for the next sign of trouble. Afternoon passed in uneasy calm. The clouds thickened, and the light grew dim long before sunset. A cold wind began to sweep in from the north, carrying with it the smell of salt and oil. Fires flickered low in shallow pits along the dunes, their light just enough to keep the darkness from swallowing the camp entirely. Men huddled around them, speaking in low voices or saying nothing at all. The sea, dark and smooth under the night sky, gave nothing away. Somewhere out there was home, but here, in the cold sand and the silence between raids, it felt farther away than ever. The 11th day began in a haze of sea mist that clung to the beach like a shroud. Visibility was poor. The farthest dunes were only vague shapes, and the horizon had vanished entirely. The men moved through the pale fog, as if they were walking inside a dream, their boots crunching softly on damp sand. The mist dampened sound, muting the crash of the waves and the distant thud of artillery, but it couldn't hide the sharp tang of smoke and oil that lingered in the air. In some ways, the fog felt like protection. Without clear skies, enemy aircraft were less likely to find their targets. But it also meant ships approaching the beach could be missed until they were almost upon them, and every man knew that timing mattered more than ever now. The hunger was constant, an ache that never faded. Rations had long since stopped coming in any reliable supply, and water was even scarcer. Many men carried empty canteens, keeping them out of habit rather than necessity. A few had taken to scooping small amounts of seawater to swish around in their mouths before spitting it out, just to feel some relief from the dryness. Late in the morning, voices rose near the waterline. Through the mist, the faint outline of several ships emerged, their grey hulls sliding silently toward the shore. The sight sparked movement up and down the beach, men rising from their dugouts, gathering their gear, and heading toward the landing points. The boarding was swift but tense. The fog was both a blessing and a curse, concealing them from watchful eyes but also hiding the approach of anything else. As the first groups began to climb the ramps, the low growl of engines cut through the quiet from somewhere beyond the mist. The sound grew sharper, more distinct, until the unmistakable scream of dive bombers shattered the illusion of safety. The planes appeared like shadows overhead, their dark shapes slicing through the gray. Bombs fell in quick succession, the blasts muffled slightly by the fog, but still powerful enough to shake the ground. Sand sprayed into the air, and the sharp scent of cordite filled every breath. One of the smaller ships took a direct hit, its bow rising briefly, before sliding under the surface in seconds. The surviving vessels pulled away as soon as they could, leaving behind men who had been only minutes from escape. The rest of the day passed under the same blanket of mist, the air damp and cold. Men huddled in small groups for warmth, their breaths forming faint clouds in the chilled air. The town behind them was barely visible now, just a darker smudge against the pale background. Patrols ventured out less often. There was little point when supplies were nearly gone and the enemy was so close. By evening, the fog thickened again, swallowing even the nearest wrecks in the shallows. Fires were nearly impossible to keep alight in the damp air, and most men settled for wrapping themselves in whatever dry material they had left, lying close together to share what warmth they could. Somewhere beyond the mist lay the open channel and the way home, but as the night wore on, the fog made it feel as though the world ended at the edge of the dunes, and that all that existed was this strip of cold, wet sand and the men waiting on it. The 12th day broke with a thin, cold rain that fell steadily over the beach, turning the sand into a damp, clinging mess that stuck to boots and uniforms alike. It wasn't heavy enough to wash anything clean, but it soaked through clothing quickly, chilling the men to the bone. The sea was restless under the grey sky, small whitecaps forming as the wind picked up from the northwest. Every now and then, a stronger gust would send fine spray drifting in from the water, stinging exposed skin and leaving the taste of salt on the lips. The ruins of the town seemed darker in the wet light, their jagged edges glistening where the rain had slicked the stone. The smoke from smoldering fires mixed with the damp air, creating a heavy, acrid smell that clung to everything. The artillery from inland was louder now, the reports sharp enough to make the ground tremble in short bursts. Patrols returning from the edges of the perimeter said the Germans were closer, pushing forward street by street, but still not committing to a full assault. It was as if they were content to let the weather, hunger and fear grind the defenders down. In the morning, there were no ships on the horizon, just the grey line where sea met sky. Men kept watch anyway, their eyes scanning the water through the drizzle, hoods pulled low, or helmets tilted forward to keep the rain from running into their faces. The waiting was harder in weather like this. Cold and wet seeped into every joint, making movements stiff and slow. Even small tasks, tightening straps, checking a rifle, took longer. Rations were gone for many, and the few who still had something to eat kept it hidden until they could take a bite without drawing attention. Around midday, a faint shout carried along the beach. Shapes were moving far out to sea, just visible through the curtain of rain. The news traveled quickly. Ships were coming. Lines formed almost instantly, men standing shoulder to shoulder, gear clutched close. The vessels approached slowly, their grey hulls cutting steadily through the choppy water. When they finally reached the shore, the ramps clattered down, and the boarding began. But it was never that simple at Dunkirk. The deep, throbbing sound of engines rose from inland, followed by the sharp wail of sirens on the ships. Moments later, the bombers appeared, dark shapes dropping out of the clouds, moving fast. Explosions ripped across the shallows, throwing up water and sand in great plumes. One of the ramps collapsed under the blast of a near miss, sending men scrambling back to the beach. In the confusion, only a fraction of those waiting managed to board before the ships pulled away, forced to retreat under the threat of more attacks. When the noise faded, the rain seemed even colder. Men trudged back to the dunes, water dripping from their helmets, their shoulders hunched against the wind. The rest of the afternoon passed in near silence, broken only by the occasional distant boom of artillery, or the hiss of rain against the sand. By evening, the temperature had dropped further, and fires were difficult to keep alive in the damp air. The men settled into the dunes, their coats pulled tight, their faces turned away from the wind. The rain continued through the night, tapping steadily against metal and canvas, as if marking the slow passage of hours until the next day began. Out on the dark water, there was no sign of returning ships, only the endless black expanse of the channel, hiding whatever fate lay ahead. The 13th day began without rain, but the air was heavy and cold, as if the storm from yesterday still lingered just out of sight. A pale, washed-out light crept over the horizon, revealing the beach in muted tones of gray and brown. The tide was low, exposing more of the shallows and the wreckage caught there, half-sunken boats, broken planks, twisted bits of metal. The smell of salt mixed with the sharp tang of oil from a shattered hull drifting not far from the waterline. Men stirred slowly from their makeshift shelters in the dunes, their movements sluggish from another night of broken sleep. Some walked to the edge of the water, staring out at the flat expanse of the channel, as if searching for a familiar coastline that was far beyond sight. Others busied themselves with small routines, checking their rifles, tightening straps, brushing the damp sand from their uniforms. These simple actions helped pass the time, though nothing truly lifted the weight of waiting. Food had become more than scarce for many, it no longer existed. The ache of hunger was constant now, a dull pressure that made hands tremble and thoughts wander. Water was rationed in sips so small they barely wet the tongue. Conversations were few and brief. Most of the men had nothing left to say. By mid-morning the quiet was broken by the distant hum of engines. Heads turned, scanning the horizon, and soon shapes began to appear. 3 ships, their outlines blurred by a thin haze. The sight brought a muted stir of movement along the beach. Men began to gather in lines, their gear slung across tired shoulders. The vessels drew closer, and for a few minutes it seemed as though this evacuation might pass without incident. But Dunkirk was never generous for long. The low drone of aircraft began to rise from inland, joined by the sharper whine of dive bombers approaching fast. The attack came suddenly, bombs falling into the shallows, sending columns of water and sand high into the air. One of the ships took a hit near the stern, smoke pouring from its deck as it began to pull away under heavy strain. Still, the loading continued, men boarding in a rush, each one vanishing into the gray as the vessel turned toward home. Those left behind stood watching until the ships were no more than faint shadows in the mist. Afternoon brought a restless wind, whipping the surface of the sea into small waves and scattering loose sand along the beach. The cold seemed sharper now, cutting through coats and damp uniforms. Some men dug deeper into the dunes, creating shelters from the wind. Others simply sat with their backs to the slope, eyes closed, trying to hold on to what little warmth they could find. The town behind them was silent, its broken buildings standing like dark teeth against the pale sky. The only sound was the distant, irregular thud of artillery. As evening fell, the wind eased, but the temperature dropped further. Fires flickered in shallow pits, their light casting long shadows across the dunes. Men spoke little, their voices low and rough from thirst. Beyond the edge of the firelight, the sea was black and endless, its surface reflecting faint glimmers from the stars above. Somewhere in that darkness, ships might be making their way toward them, or perhaps they were not. The uncertainty was as heavy as the hunger, and it would follow them into another night of waiting. The 14th day started with a thin layer of frost clinging to the sand in the shaded hollows of the dunes. The cold had crept in during the night, sharp enough to bite through coats and leave a brittle edge on every breath. The sea was calmer than it had been in days, its surface broken only by the slow rise and fall of swells rolling in from the open channel. The early light caught the wreckage along the shallows, blackened ribs of boats, twisted beams, and the ghostly silhouettes of debris just below the waterline. The men moved quietly in the morning, their movements slow and deliberate. Some took to walking the shoreline, scanning the distance for any sign of ships, their boots crunching in the frozen crust of sand. Others stayed near their shelters, conserving energy and warmth. Hunger was no longer an ache. It had become a constant, dull emptiness that hollowed out faces and left eyes sunken. Water was scarce enough that some men went a full day without a sip, their lips cracked and voices hoarse. By mid-morning, faint shapes appeared on the horizon. 3 ships, one larger than the others, their approach slow but steady. Word traveled down the beach, and lines began to form. The process was almost silent now, the urgency subdued, every man knowing there would never be enough room for all. When the vessels drew close enough to make out their decks, the loading began. Boots thudded on wet planks, hands gripped ropes slick with seawater. But before the work could be finished, the distant growl of engines rolled in from inland. Men froze for an instant before the familiar whistle of bombs cut the air. Dive bombers swept in low, their sirens wailing, and the beach erupted into sprays of sand and smoke. One of the smaller ships was hit squarely, flames leaping from its midsection before it slipped under the water. The remaining vessels pulled away, their decks crowded with men, leaving behind those who had not yet reached the ramps. Afternoon brought a restless wind from the east, scattering sand into stinging flurries that scraped against skin and eyes. The town behind them was silent, its jagged ruins silhouetted against the pale winter light. Patrols reported seeing enemy movement in the distance. Small groups shifting among the rubble, too far to engage, but close enough to remind everyone how narrow the perimeter had become. As evening fell, the wind dropped, leaving the beach in a brittle stillness. Fires burned low in the dunes, the flames flickering weakly in the cold air. Men huddled close to the warmth, their shadows stretching long and thin across the sand. Beyond the firelight, the sea was dark and vast, the line of the horizon nearly invisible. Somewhere out there lay the path to safety, but here, under the frost and the stars, it felt as far away as it had on the first day. The night passed in silence, broken only by the hiss of the tide, and the occasional crack of distant artillery, each sound a reminder that the waiting was not over. The 15th day came with a dull, colorless dawn, the kind of light that seemed to flatten the world into shades of gray. The sea was quiet at first, a faint mist hanging low over the water, and the air carried the faint tang of smoke from somewhere inland. The beach was almost still in those early hours, the men moving slowly, shoulders hunched against the chill. Boots crunched on frozen patches of sand, and each exhale hung in the air before drifting away. The hunger had long since become more than a physical need. It was a weight that slowed thought, dulled reaction, and made every action feel like pushing through water. Water itself had become more precious than anything. A few men still carried half-filled canteens, and these were guarded as closely as weapons. Conversations about home, once common in the first days, had faded almost entirely. Now most spoke only when necessary, their voices low, their words brief. In the late morning, the sound of engines came from far out to sea. Shapes began to form in the haze. Ships, more than had been seen in several days, moving steadily toward shore. The sight stirred a ripple of movement down the beach, and lines began to form almost instinctively. For a few moments the possibility of escape seemed real. But as the vessels closed in, the sky to the west filled with the low growl of approaching aircraft. Men cursed under their breath, their eyes lifting to search for the source. Bombers swept in from high above, their shadows cutting across the pale sand. The first explosions landed in the shallows, sending great columns of water and sand into the air. A larger ship took a near miss, rocking violently as men scrambled to keep their footing. Despite the attack, loading continued. Boots on ramps shouted orders, the metallic clank of gear against metal decks. When the ships finally pulled away, packed with as many men as they could take, the beach fell back into its uneasy stillness. Afternoon brought a thin, cold wind that rattled loose scraps of debris, and carried with it the bitter scent of burning fuel. The town's ruins were silent, though a patrol reported seeing faint movement beyond the far edge of the streets, too far to identify, but close enough to remind them that the enemy was still pressing in. By evening, the wind had dropped, but the cold grew sharper. Fires flickered in small pits dug into the dunes, their light barely enough to touch the faces of the men gathered around them. Beyond the glow, the sea stretched into darkness, its surface black and empty. The sound of the tide filled the silence, each wave sliding in and pulling back with a slow, measured rhythm. The men settled into the sand, pulling their coats tight, staring out at the horizon as if they could will a ship to appear. Somewhere in the night, the enemy's artillery rumbled faintly, a reminder that time was running thin. But for now, all they could do was wait for the morning, and whatever it might bring. The 16th day began under a low, unbroken ceiling of clouds that seemed to press down on the beach, making the air feel heavy and close. The sea was a dull sheet of gray, the horizon barely visible where it met the equally colorless sky. The tide was out, leaving a wide swath of wet sand that gleamed faintly in the dim light. Scattered across it were the bones of wrecked boats, their ribs jutting out like the remains of some great sea creatures. The men moved quietly in the morning, their breath visible in the cold air. The night had been restless. Artillery fire had echoed intermittently from inland, each blast deep enough to feel in the chest. The Germans were closer now, and every man could sense it. Patrols had returned with reports of movement in the outskirts of the ruined town, small groups shifting through the rubble, watching. Still, the direct assault hadn't come, and that absence felt almost worse than an attack. It was like living under the shadow of a blow that never fell. Hunger was now an unshakable companion. The men's faces were drawn, their cheeks hollow, and their uniforms hung loose on thinner frames. Water was even rarer. Canteens passed from hand to hand with sips so small they barely wet their lips. No one complained anymore. Complaints took energy, and energy was too valuable to waste. Late in the morning, the faint thrum of engines came from far out to sea. Heads turned as dark shapes began to form in the haze. Several ships, their approach steady. A ripple of movement passed along the beach, as men rose from their shelters, and formed into quiet lines. The loading began as soon as the ramps dropped, boots striking wet planks, gear clattering, as men climbed aboard. For a few precious minutes, it looked as though this departure might happen without incident. But then the air changed. The distant rising growl of aircraft engines rolled in from inland. The first bombs struck the water just off the beach, throwing up geysers of spray and smoke. Dive bombers swooped low, their sirens screaming, releasing their payloads into the shallows. One of the smaller ships was hit near the bow, flames bursting from the impact point before it began to list toward the water. Men on the beach dropped flat, covering their heads as sand and debris rained down. Still, in the chaos, loading continued until the surviving ships had to pull away, leaving many still standing on the shore. Afternoon brought a bitter wind that swept in from the sea, carrying the salt sting into the dunes. The fires some men had tried to light sputtered and died quickly, the gusts scattering the warmth before it could spread. The ruins of the town loomed behind them, their blackened outlines stark against the pale sky. Somewhere in those broken streets the enemy waited, and everyone knew they would not wait forever. As night fell, the temperature dropped sharply. The beach became a stretch of dark shapes, men huddled in shallow pits or dugouts, wrapped in whatever they could find. The sound of the tide was steady and slow, but beyond it, faint and far, the low hum of engines drifted across the water. Some men raised their heads, listening, wondering if ships were coming in the dark. But no lights appeared, and the hum faded, leaving only the cold, the sand, and the endless waiting for a morning that might bring rescue, or the end. The 17th day arrived with a thin, brittle light creeping over the dunes, casting long shadows across the uneven sand. The cold was sharper than yesterday, the kind that seeped into bones and made fingers slow to move. The tide was low at first light, exposing dark stretches of wet sand that reflected the pale sky. The wreckage scattered across the shallows looked more skeletal than ever. Broken masts, shattered hulls, and bits of rope swaying gently in the water. The men stirred reluctantly from their shelters, their breath hanging in the chill air. Most moved stiffly, conserving energy. Hunger had stripped away any trace of fullness from their faces, leaving hollow eyes and gaunt cheeks. The thirst was worse. Most had gone a day or more without proper water, their lips cracked and voices little more than rasps. By mid-morning, the first faint shapes appeared on the horizon. Ships, their grey hulls barely distinguishable from the haze. The sight was enough to pull the men to their feet, though they moved without noise or cheer. Lines formed with practiced efficiency, each man taking his place without argument. The vessels drew closer, the sound of their engines mixing with the slow hiss of the tide. When the ramps finally dropped, boarding began quickly, boots clattering against the damp wood. But just as the first groups reached the decks, the now familiar roar of aircraft engines came from inland. The bombers broke through the low clouds without warning, their dark silhouettes diving toward the shore. Explosions ripped across the shallows, throwing up water, sand, and shrapnel. One of the largest ships took a direct hit amidships, the impact shrouding it in a bloom of black smoke. Men ducked and scrambled, some pressing themselves into the dunes, others continuing to board despite the chaos. Within minutes, the surviving ships were forced to pull away under fire, leaving behind dozens who had been within sight of escape. The rest of the day passed in an uneasy quiet. The beach, pitted with new craters, and littered with fresh debris, felt even smaller. The ruins of the town loomed behind them, dark against the pale winter light, the outlines of broken walls standing like watchmen. Patrols reported the enemy's presence edging closer, their movements more frequent, their observation more deliberate. The wind picked up in the afternoon, scattering fine sand into stinging flurries. Fires were difficult to keep lit, and most men chose to huddle together in the dunes, their heads down against the gusts. Evening fell with a dull, fading light, the sky bruised with low clouds. The sea turned black, the waves glinting faintly as they rolled in and out. The sound of the tide was steady, almost hypnotic, but no ships appeared against the dark horizon. Men lay close to the sand, rifles beside them, their eyes half closed but never fully asleep. Somewhere inland, the dull thud of artillery rolled through the night air, a steady reminder that time was slipping away. The beach, the sea, and the sky had all become the same color, cold, dark, and endless. The 18th day began with the wind already up, sweeping across the open beach and flattening the tops of the small waves that rolled in from the channel. The air was bitter, the kind that burned the inside of the nose and made every breath feel sharper. The sand underfoot was hard-packed from the cold, crunching faintly beneath boots. The dunes offered some shelter, but the wind found its way into every gap, tugging at coats and carrying with it the scent of salt and distant smoke. The town's ruins stood like black teeth against the pale sky, the outlines of shattered walls jagged and irregular. Patrols returned early, reporting that the enemy was moving more boldly through the far edges of the streets, and a few men claimed to have heard voices carried by the wind. The artillery was closer now. Each blast inland was louder, sharper, as if the perimeter was being tested from multiple points. Hunger had reduced most of the men to quiet shadows of themselves. There were no more rations to speak of, and water was little more than a memory for many. Some men sat with empty canteens in their laps, turning them over slowly in their hands, as if by staring long enough, something might appear inside. The horizon stayed empty for most of the morning. Men watched anyway, their eyes scanning the distance out of habit more than hope. It was past midday when a murmur went up along the beach. Ships, faint shapes emerging from the haze. There were more than usual, their dark hulls cutting through the cold water. Men rose from their shelters, moving to form lines without needing to be told. The vessels came in steady and sure, the sound of their engines carrying over the wind. Ramps dropped, and boarding began quickly. Boots struck wet planks, the clatter of gear mixing with the creak of ropes, but the moment felt too smooth, and within minutes, the now familiar roar of aircraft began to build from inland. The bombers came low and fast, their shadows sweeping over the sand. The first bombs hit the shallows, sending columns of water and mud skyward. One ramp was blown apart in an instant, throwing men into the water. Another ship took a glancing hit, its side blackened by fire. Amid the chaos, loading continued, men pushing forward in bursts whenever the noise lessened. The surviving ships pulled away under heavy smoke, their decks crowded with dark silhouettes, leaving behind those who had been only steps away from boarding. The rest of the day dragged under a leaden sky. The wind shifted, coming in colder from the east, and fires in the dunes burned low, the smoke trailing flat across the sand. The beach was scarred with new craters, and the air smelled strongly of burnt fuel and wet metal. The men left behind moved less, conserving what little strength they had. Evening came quickly, the light fading to a dull steel gray. Beyond the dunes the town was a silhouette, and in the distance, flashes of artillery lit the horizon. In the dark, the sea became an unbroken expanse, the sound of the tide, the only thing that didn't change. Some men lay awake, eyes fixed on the horizon, listening for the low hum of engines that might mean another chance to leave. Others closed their eyes, not to sleep, but to shut out the endless sameness of the waiting. The cold deepened, and by midnight, frost had begun to form again on the sand, sparkling faintly in the thin light of the moon. The night was long, and the silence between distant explosions felt heavier than the blasts themselves. Somewhere out there, beyond the black water, was home. But here on the beach, it felt as far away as the moon itself. The 19th day began with a cold mist rolling in from the channel, so thick it seemed to muffle the world. The sea and sky blended into one pale wall, and the beach felt cut off from everything beyond its edges. Men moved like shadows within the fog, their shapes appearing and vanishing as they walked between the dunes or along the waterline. The dampness clung to uniforms, soaking through fabric and chilling the skin. Every surface glistened, from the blackened beams of wrecked boats to the metal barrels half buried in the sand. The enemy's artillery fire had been steady through the night, sporadic, but always near enough to remind them of the tightening perimeter. Patrols returning at dawn reported seeing movement in the ruins again, the shapes of figures shifting behind collapsed walls, and hearing the metallic clatter of equipment carried on the wind. The men barely reacted. Such news no longer brought surprise, only the confirmation of what they already felt in their bones. Hunger was a constant ache, gnawing and unrelenting. Some had not eaten in days, their strength draining away slowly. Water was almost non-existent now. Canteens hung empty at belts, carried out of habit rather than use. A few men cupped rainwater from the folds of their coats, catching what little the mist could provide. Hours passed with no sign of ships, the fog swallowing the horizon entirely. The waiting was different in weather like this. It was heavier, more oppressive, as though the mist itself were pressing them into the sand. By midday, faint vibrations trembled through the ground before the low thrum of engines reached their ears. Dark shapes began to emerge from the haze, first as ghosts, then as the solid outlines of several ships. The men moved toward the waterline, forming into lines with quiet efficiency. The fog made every sound louder. The slap of waves against hulls, the clatter of ramps being lowered, the thud of boots on wet wood. Boarding began quickly, the ships taking on as many as they could. But the fog could not hide them forever. The sharp growl of aircraft engines came suddenly, echoing strangely in the mist. The bombers dropped into view without warning, their silhouettes barely visible until they were nearly overhead. Explosions tore through the shallows, the blasts muffled but no less deadly. One vessel shuddered violently under a near miss, water pouring over its side. Men scattered for cover where they could, some diving into the dunes, others crouching low on the ramps until the attack passed. In minutes the surviving ships pulled away, their outlines swallowed once again by the grey. The afternoon brought a biting wind that cut through the fog, and set it drifting in uneven waves. The beach looked like a battlefield of ghosts, wreckage looming suddenly from the haze before fading back into it. Fires were difficult to keep lit in the damp air, and most men huddled together for warmth, their helmets and coats beaded with droplets. The sound of the tide was constant, the only rhythm in a place where time seemed to stand still. By nightfall, the mist had thickened again, and the world shrank to the small circle each man could see around himself. The artillery fire inland was louder now, sharper, each blast punching through the fog with a flash of orange light. The men settled into the dunes, their weapons close, their eyes fixed on the unseen darkness beyond. Somewhere out there, in the shifting grey and the black water, the next chance for escape might already be on its way, or it might never come. The only thing they knew for certain was that the night would be cold, and the morning would bring more waiting. The 20th day began under a sky streaked with thin high clouds that let in a muted, pale light. The wind had dropped during the night, leaving the air cold but still. The tide was halfway in, the waves moving slowly over the sand, pulling at pieces of wreckage caught in the shallows. The beach smelled strongly of salt and smoke, a combination that had become as familiar as the feel of damp boots and the weight of a rifle. The ruins of the town were dark against the morning light, their jagged silhouettes broken only by the occasional flicker of movement, a patrol shifting through the debris, or perhaps something less friendly. Few men even bothered to look anymore. They knew the enemy was there, and they knew that each day the noose tightened a little more. Hunger had worn away at the men until even the act of standing felt like an effort. Rations were gone, and water was little more than a memory. A few had fashioned crude containers from bits of metal or tin, catching the weak drizzle that sometimes passed for rain. Thirst made their lips crack and their voices rough, and many had taken to keeping silent simply to avoid speaking. The morning hours passed without any sign of ships. Men kept watch anyway, their eyes moving slowly across the horizon, searching for the faint gray shapes that meant rescue. It was nearly midday when the first distant vibration came through the ground, followed by the low, steady hum of engines. The ships appeared slowly, their outlines growing clearer as they approached. There were more than usual today, naval vessels and smaller craft alike, moving steadily through the cold water. The beach stirred into motion, lines forming quickly but without noise. The ramps came down, and boarding began. Boots hit wet wood, the sound of gear clinking faintly in the still air. Then, almost inevitably, the warning came, the rising growl of aircraft engines from inland. Bombers swept in low, their shadows racing across the sand before the first explosions ripped into the shallows. Water and mud shot into the air, and the sharp smell of cordite mixed with the salt wind. One ship near the center of the line took a direct hit, the blast tearing into its side and sending men scrambling into the water. Still, the loading continued until the surviving ships had no choice but to pull away, smoke trailing from their funnels as they vanished into the haze. Afternoon brought a restless quiet. The wind returned in short gusts, rattling loose debris and stirring the sand into fine clouds. The men left behind retreated to the dunes, sitting in small groups or lying flat, their coats pulled tight against the cold. The fires they lit burned low, fed by scraps of wood pulled from the wreckage. The town loomed in the background, its ruins as still as stone, though the occasional distant crack of rifle fire suggested it was not empty. As the light faded, the beach took on the color of iron, the sea darkening until it was nearly black. The sound of the tide grew louder in the still air, a steady rhythm that seemed to mark the passing of time in place of clocks or watches. Night came without ceremony, the stars hidden behind a thin veil of cloud. The men settled in as best they could, some lying in shallow pits in the sand, others leaning against the dunes. Somewhere inland, artillery spoke again, sharp cracks rolling across the flat ground, each one closer than the last. But here, at the edge of the water, the only choice was to wait, eyes fixed on the horizon, hoping for the faint glimmer of a ship's light in the dark. The 21st day arrived with the sky the color of steel, flat and unbroken, casting a dull light over the beach. The air was cold and damp, the kind that sank into clothing and made it feel heavier. The tide was pulling out, leaving behind rippled stretches of wet sand where the water had been, along with the scattered remains of wreckage. Broken oars, splintered planks, and bits of twisted metal that had once been part of ships. The ruins of the town loomed dark and silent behind the dunes. Patrols moving through them at dawn reported hearing movement again, the faint clink of gear and muffled voices that could only belong to the enemy. The men listened without surprise. The sound of the war closing in was nothing new now. Hunger had become part of every moment. It wasn't a sharp pain anymore, but a deep, steady weakness that made every step feel heavier. Rations had long since disappeared, and water was so scarce that some men had not drunk properly in 2 days. The cold wind didn't help. It dried lips and throats even more, and the salt in the air only deepened the thirst. Morning passed slowly, the horizon staying empty. Men watched it out of habit, their eyes scanning the gray line where sea met sky, but there was nothing to see. It wasn't until midday that the first low hum of engines carried across the water. Shapes began to form, emerging from the haze. Ships, 3 large ones and several smaller craft, heading steadily toward the shore. The sight brought movement, slow at first, then purposeful, as men gathered their gear and formed into lines. Boarding began as soon as the ramps clattered down onto the wet sand. Boots thudded on the wood, hands gripped ropes and rails, and the ships began to fill. But it was never without risk. The distant rumble of aircraft came from inland, growing louder until the first dark shapes appeared against the pale sky. Bombers swept in fast, their shadows racing ahead of them. The first explosion sent fountains of sand and water into the air, shaking the ground. One of the smaller ships took a direct hit at the stern, fire blooming and spreading across its deck. Men on the beach dove for cover, pressing themselves into the dunes as shrapnel hissed through the air. Despite the chaos, the boarding continued until the remaining ships had to pull away, their decks crowded, their wakes cutting white lines into the dark water. Afternoon brought a biting wind that swept across the beach, scattering loose sand and tugging at the edges of makeshift shelters. Fires in the dunes burned low, fed by scraps of wood scavenged from the wreckage. The men huddled around them, their faces shadowed in the flickering light. The town behind them stayed quiet, but the occasional flash from inland told them that the silence was not peace. It was preparation. As evening fell, the sea turned black under the darkening sky. The sound of the tide grew louder in the stillness, filling the spaces between the distant thuds of artillery. Men settled into the sand, weapons close at hand, their eyes fixed on the horizon. The night was long, the cold sharp, and every hour felt like a question without an answer. Would rescue come tomorrow? Or would the next dawn bring something else entirely? The 22nd day began with the sky breaking into streaks of pale gold and gray, the first real hint of sunlight they had seen in days. It did little to warm the air, but it lifted the haze just enough to make the horizon clear. The sea was calm, rolling in gentle swells, and the tide was low, revealing the blackened skeletons of wrecked boats resting in the shallows. The smell of salt and smoke was ever present, and the faint tang of fuel drifted in from somewhere offshore. Behind the dunes, the ruins of the town still stood in jagged silence, but the men knew the quiet was deceptive. Patrols reported the enemy drawing closer again, their movements now visible in the far streets. The artillery had been more frequent during the night, each blast a little nearer than before. The men had learned to measure distance by the weight of the sound in their chests, and now that weight was heavy. Hunger had reached the point where it was almost numbing. The body had stopped expecting food. Water was the greater torment, and many carried empty canteens simply because leaving them behind felt like giving up. The morning passed with nothing on the horizon, the men keeping watch out of habit rather than expectation. When the sound of engines finally came from the sea, It seemed almost too far away to be real. But slowly, shapes appeared. 4 ships, one of them large enough to carry hundreds. The beach stirred into motion, lines forming in practiced silence. The vessels came in steadily, their bows cutting through the cold water, until the ramps dropped and the loading began. Boots pounded on wet planks, gear clinked, and men moved quickly but without panic. Then the familiar threat returned. The deep rising growl of aircraft came from inland, and the first dark shapes broke through the clouds overhead. Dive bombers descended, their sirens wailing, releasing bombs into the shallows and the beach. Explosions threw up water and sand, the concussions slamming into the chest and ringing in the ears. One of the smaller ships was struck directly, tilting sharply before slipping beneath the waves. Still, boarding continued until the surviving vessels had to pull away, their decks crowded with dark silhouettes disappearing into the mist. Afternoon came with a shifting wind from the east, colder and sharper than before. Fires in the dunes struggled against the gusts, their smoke trailing low across the sand. The men left behind sat in small groups, their coats pulled tight, their eyes fixed on the sea, as though they could will another ship to appear. The town loomed in the background, black against the fading light, and the occasional glint from its broken windows suggested more than just empty ruins. As night fell, the temperature dropped quickly. The sea became a black sheet under the starlight, and the sound of the tide filled the silence between the distant booms of artillery. Men lay in shallow hollows in the sand, weapons close, their eyes open to the darkness. Each one knew that time was running out, though no one could say how much was left. The night seemed longer than any before it, and the horizon remained empty until the sky began to pale again. The 23rd day began under a sky heavy with clouds, their edges tinged with a faint yellow from the low morning light. The air was damp, cold enough to sting exposed skin, and the sand was dark and wet from the tide that had only just begun to retreat. Small pools reflected the dull sky, and in them lay bits of splintered wood, tangled ropes and rusted fragments of metal from long destroyed vessels. The sea was restless, rolling in steady swells that slapped against the wreckage in the shallows with a hollow sound. Behind the dunes the town's broken outline was visible, jagged and uneven, like a row of rotten teeth. Patrols sent into its edges before dawn returned quickly, reporting fresh signs of the enemy, footprints in the dust, small fires still smoldering, the impression that eyes were watching from the shadows. No one doubted that the Germans were tightening their hold, step by step. The artillery spoke more often during the night, the deep concussions rolling in closer, each one a little heavier in the chest than the last. Hunger was beyond sharp now. It was a constant weakness, the kind that blurred the edges of thought and made simple movements feel like labor. Men's faces were thinner, their eyes sunken, and many had stopped talking altogether, unless it was absolutely necessary. Water was almost gone, and some had resorted to scraping frost from bits of metal or stone in the mornings, just to wet their tongues. The beach was quiet through the first hours of daylight, the men keeping to their dugouts or sitting in small groups along the dunes, watching the horizon without speaking. The calm was deceptive. Shortly before midday, the low thrum of engines began to seep into the air from far out to sea. Heads lifted almost in unison, and soon the gray shapes of ships began to emerge from the haze. There were more than in recent days: 2 large destroyers, several smaller craft, and what looked like a converted fishing vessel riding low in the water. The men gathered quickly, forming lines with the quiet precision that came from weeks of repeating the same desperate routine. The ramps came down, and boarding began at once. The sound of boots on wet planks, the snap of orders, the creak of ropes. Everything moved quickly but without panic. For a few moments, it seemed possible that the operation might be completed before the inevitable attack. But the moment didn't last. The low, growing hum of aircraft engines rolled in from inland, followed by the sudden roar of dive bombers breaking through the clouds. Their sirens screamed, and in seconds the first explosions ripped through the shallows, sending up fountains of water and sand. One of the smaller craft took a direct hit, disappearing into a cloud of smoke and spray. Men ducked for cover, some pressing themselves flat into the sand, others trying to push forward onto the ships before they were forced to leave. The surviving vessels pulled away quickly, their decks crammed, their wakes trailing white lines across the dark water until they vanished into the mist. Those left behind returned to their positions slowly, some carrying wounded, others simply dropping into the dunes, with the hollow look of men who had been one step away from escape. The afternoon wore on under a sky that seemed lower than before, the clouds pressing down and muting the light. The wind shifted, carrying with it the smell of smoke and something sharper, burning fuel from one of the wrecks offshore. Fires in the dunes burned low, fed by scraps of wood scavenged from debris. The town behind them stayed silent, though every man knew it was no longer empty. As the evening fell, the beach turned to a wash of grays and blacks, the sea almost indistinguishable from the sky. The tide's rhythm filled the gaps between the distant cracks of artillery, and in the darkness, the men lay with their weapons close, listening for the hum of engines that might mean another chance. The cold grew sharper, frost beginning to form again on the sand, and every breath rose in pale clouds before vanishing into the night. The hours stretched endlessly, each one feeling like a test of endurance against both the enemy and the elements. The 24th day began with a dim, muted light creeping across the beach, the kind that made it hard to tell where night ended and morning began. A fine mist clung to the air, softening the outlines of everything, the jagged shapes of wrecked boats in the shallows, the uneven line of dunes, the blackened remains of the town in the distance. The sea was restless, the tide pushing in with a slow, steady force, each wave curling around bits of debris before pulling back. The sound was constant, a low rumble that seemed to echo in the chest. The men stirred from their shallow shelters reluctantly, their movements slow and stiff from the cold that had seeped into every joint during the night. Hunger was an unshakable weight now, a dull exhaustion that blurred their focus. Faces were drawn tight over sharp cheekbones, lips cracked and pale. Water was nearly gone. Canteens clinked empty when moved, and a few men tipped them hopefully toward their mouths only to find nothing. The morning hours passed in uneasy stillness. The horizon was clear of ships, and though the men watched it out of habit, there was no real expectation in their eyes. Patrols into the town reported the same as the day before. Movement in the shadows, shapes glimpsed between broken walls, and the feeling of being watched. The artillery spoke less frequently now, but when it did, the blasts were closer, sharper, and the echoes lingered longer. It was shortly after midday when the first vibration of engines drifted in from the sea. The sound was faint at first, easily mistaken for the wind, but it grew steadily until the silhouettes of several ships appeared against the haze. The sight pulled the men to their feet. They gathered in lines without needing orders, each one gripping his gear, eyes fixed on the approaching vessels. The ships moved in steadily, 2 large naval craft and several smaller boats riding low in the water. The ramps dropped, and boarding began at once. Boots clattered on the planks. The sound of equipment mixed with curt orders shouted over the wash of the tide. For a moment, it felt as though the operation might go smoothly. But Dunkirk rarely allowed that kind of mercy. The low growl of aircraft engines began inland, faint at first, then rising, until the first bombers broke through the clouds. Their shadows swept across the sand, followed by the scream of dive bombers dropping low over the water. Explosions tore into the shallows, sending great plumes of water and debris into the air. One of the smaller boats was hit directly, vanishing in a flash of fire and smoke. Men dove for cover where they could, into the dunes, behind wreckage, even into the freezing shallows. The boarding continued amid the chaos, the ramps slick with seawater and sand. When the surviving ships pulled away, their decks were packed tight, leaving behind those who hadn't made it on in time. The beach returned to its uneasy quiet, marked only by the distant sound of engines fading into the mist. The rest of the day passed in subdued stillness. Fires in the dunes burned low, their smoke curling thin into the damp air. The men sat in small groups, their eyes following the horizon without speaking. The town behind them loomed darker as the light began to fade, and the occasional flash in the distance suggested the enemy was still advancing, step by step. As night fell, the temperature dropped sharply. Frost began to form on the sand again, the grains sparkling faintly in the moonlight. The sea turned black, and the tide whispered steadily, a sound as steady and indifferent as it had been since the first day. The men lay close to the ground, their weapons within reach, their breath rising in pale clouds. Somewhere out beyond the dark water was the path home. But here, in the cold and the silence, it felt like another world entirely. The 25th day came with a sky the color of iron, heavy and low, pressing the light flat against the beach. The air smelled of damp sand, cold salt, and the faint bitterness of fuel drifting in from somewhere offshore. The tide was receding, leaving behind glistening stretches of wet ground where the water had pulled back, revealing the jagged skeletons of shattered boats and the scattered bones of the evacuation, helmets, broken rifles, torn packs half buried in the sand. The men rose from their shelters in slow, deliberate movements, conserving strength. Hunger was no longer sharp, it was a constant numbness that dulled every action. Faces were pale, lips cracked, and eyes hollow from nights without proper rest. Water was nearly gone, and some had given up carrying their empty canteens altogether, leaving them abandoned in the sand. Behind the dunes, the ruins of the town stood silent, though the faint glint of sunlight off glass or metal, deep within, suggested movement. Patrols had stopped pushing too far inside, it was too dangerous, and there was little left to find. The artillery had been quiet for most of the night, but just before dawn it spoke again, several shells slamming into the outskirts of the town, and sending echoes rolling across the beach. Men had learned not to flinch at the sound, it was part of the background now. The horizon was empty for most of the morning, the sea and sky blending into the same muted gray. When the low vibration of engines finally reached the beach, it seemed at first like a trick of the wind, but then the shapes appeared. 4 ships, one of them large, with smaller craft flanking its sides. The men moved toward the waterline, forming into lines with practiced silence. The ships came in quickly, their bows slicing through the swells, until they were close enough for the ramps to drop. Boarding began immediately. Boots hit the planks in steady rhythm, and the ships filled rapidly. Then the sound they had come to expect rose again from inland, the deep, building growl of approaching aircraft. The bombers came fast, their black shapes cutting across the pale sky. The first explosions hit the water just off the beach, sending up geysers that drenched men and equipment alike. One of the smaller ships took a glancing hit, its deck erupting in fire, but it stayed afloat long enough to pull away. The loading continued under the roar of engines and the whistle of bombs, the men moving quickly, knowing every second counted. When the surviving ships pulled back, they carried away another portion of the beach's population, their wakes white against the dark water. Those left behind returned to the dunes, some carrying wounded, others simply dropping into the sand with the weight of another missed chance. The rest of the day was marked by a restless wind from the east, scattering fine sand across the beach and cutting through the layers of clothing. Fires burned weakly, their smoke trailing low under the heavy clouds. The town remained silent, though every man knew the enemy was closer now than at any point before. As darkness fell, the air grew colder, and frost began to form on the exposed sand. The sea turned black and smooth under the starlight, the tide whispering in and out as it had for weeks. The men lay low, their breath forming pale clouds, their rifles within reach. Somewhere out there, ships might be making their way toward them again. Or perhaps not. The only certainty was that another day had passed, and the waiting was not yet over. The 26th day began in a stillness so complete it felt unnatural. The wind had died overnight, and the sea lay flat under a pale, colorless sky, the horizon a thin seam between two shades of gray. The beach was damp from the retreating tide, its surface smooth, except where footprints, craters, and scattered wreckage broke the monotony. In the shallows, the skeletons of boats leaned at odd angles, their ribs jutting from the water, like the bones of creatures long dead. The men emerged slowly from their shelters, their movements mechanical, as though they were being pulled through the morning by habit alone. Hunger had hollowed them out, their uniforms hung loosely on thin frames, and every step seemed an effort. The thirst was worse than ever. Lips cracked, throats raw, voices rasping when they spoke at all. For some, speech had become rare, replaced by brief nods or gestures. Behind them, the ruins of the town stood silent, but not still. A faint flicker of movement between the jagged walls hinted that the enemy was there, watching, waiting. Patrols ventured only as far as necessary, and even then they moved with caution. The artillery had been quiet during the night, but no one mistook that for safety. It was simply the pause before the next pressure. The first hours of daylight passed without change. The horizon was empty, the sea calm. Men sat in the dunes, some staring blankly at the water, others tending to weapons out of habit more than need. It was late morning when the low hum of engines began to carry across the water. Shapes appeared slowly through the haze, 2 large ships and several smaller craft moving in close formation. The men rose and moved toward the waterline in quiet lines, each man knowing exactly where to go. The ramps dropped, and boarding began quickly. Boots pounded on wet planks, gear clattered, orders were given in curt voices. For a few precious minutes, there was only the sound of boarding, and the rhythmic slap of the tide. Then, like clockwork, the threat returned. The distant growl of aircraft swelled into the roar of bombers sweeping in from inland. The first explosions hit the shallows, throwing up columns of water that fell like heavy rain. One of the smaller boats took a direct hit, breaking apart in seconds, the sea swallowing it whole. Men dove into the dunes or crouched low on the ramps as bombs struck closer to the beach. Still, the loading continued until the surviving vessels had to pull away, their decks packed. Those left behind walked back to their shelters without speaking, the sound of the engines fading over the water. Afternoon brought a strange, brittle quiet. The air felt heavy, as if holding its breath. Fires in the dunes burned low, their smoke rising straight into the air without wind to push it. The smell of salt and fuel hung over the beach, mingling with the faint metallic tang of the sea. The town loomed behind them, darker as the light began to fade, and now and then the faint crack of rifle fire carried from its direction. As evening came, the temperature dropped quickly. The tide rolled in under a moonless sky, the waves glinting faintly where they caught the last scraps of light. Men settled into the dunes, pulling coats tighter, rifles at hand. In the darkness, the sea became an unbroken void, its sound steady and indifferent. Somewhere beyond that black expanse lay the way home, but here, at the edge of the sand, the only certainty was that another day had ended, and the waiting would begin again with the dawn. The 27th day began, beneath a low, unbroken ceiling of clouds that seemed to weigh the air down. The light was flat and cold, making the sand appear almost the same color as the sea. The tide had pulled back during the night, leaving wide stretches of wet ground where small pools collected in the craters and depressions, left by weeks of bombardment. Bits of wood, twisted metal, and fragments of rope lay scattered across the beach like relics of a forgotten fleet. The men rose slowly, their movements deliberate, conserving energy they no longer had to spare. Their faces were gaunt, their eyes ringed with shadows, their uniforms hanging loose on frames worn thin by hunger. Water was almost non-existent now. The few canteens that still sloshed faintly were guarded like treasures, their contents rationed to the smallest possible sips. Behind the dunes, the ruins of the town were dark and still. Patrols no longer ventured far. There was no point. The enemy was there, that much was certain. and every man could feel the invisible pressure of their presence. The artillery had spoken only twice in the night, but the blasts were close enough to shake sand from the dunes. The first hours of daylight passed without incident. Men stayed low in their shelters, scanning the horizon. The air was damp, and the cold sank into fingers and toes, making them stiff and slow to respond. It was late morning, when the distant thrum of engines began to seep into the air from out at sea. Slowly, shapes took form against the horizon. 3 ships, 1 large and 2 smaller, moving steadily toward the shore. The men gathered without orders, their lines forming out of muscle memory. The ramps clattered down, and the boarding began at once. Boots struck the wet planks, the creak of ropes mingled with short, sharp commands. For several minutes the work went smoothly, but the calm didn't last. The familiar rising growl of aircraft came from inland, and moments later, the bombers appeared. Their dark shapes streaked overhead, the sirens of the dive bombers screaming as they descended. Explosions tore through the shallows and into the beach, sending walls of water and sand into the air. One of the smaller ships took a near miss that shredded part of its deck, forcing it to pull away. The larger vessel took on more men quickly, but under the shadow of another incoming attack, it too was forced to turn back. Those left on the beach stood in silence, watching the ships grow smaller against the gray horizon. Afternoon brought a chill wind from the north, carrying with it the salt sting of the sea, and the faint odor of burning fuel. Fires in the dunes were small and scarce, their flames flickering under the gusts. The men sat close to them, their shadows long against the sand. Behind them, the ruins of the town were barely visible in the fading light, but the occasional glint of metal or brief flash hinted at movement within. As darkness fell, the temperature dropped sharply, and frost began to form again on the sand. The sound of the tide filled the night, steady and unchanging. As the men lay low in the dunes, their rifles closed, their eyes fixed on the black horizon. Somewhere out there, the next chance might already be on its way, or it might never come. Either way, the night would be long, and the waiting would continue. The 28th day began with the first pale light of dawn, barely breaking through a thick layer of clouds. The sky was the same dull gray as the sea, and the horizon seemed to disappear entirely where the two met. The air was heavy with moisture, clinging to every surface, soaking into uniforms that had not been dry in weeks. The tide was coming in, waves pushing steadily toward the shore and curling around the jagged remains of wrecked craft embedded in the shallows. The sound was steady and deep, almost hypnotic, but no one was lulled by it. The men emerged slowly from their dugouts and shelters in the dunes, their movements sluggish from another night of cold and hunger. Faces were thin, eyes hollow, and hands trembled slightly with the effort of even small tasks. Water was almost gone, and the thirst was beginning to gnaw at concentration. Some men caught themselves staring at the sea, as though willing it to turn drinkable. Behind them, the shattered outline of the town was darker in the morning light, its broken walls jutting against the sky. Patrols no longer brought back supplies, only the confirmation that the enemy was closer, their presence felt if not always seen. The artillery had been intermittent through the night, its blasts sometimes far, sometimes close enough to make the sand tremble. Morning passed slowly, the beach quiet except for the soft hiss of the tide, and the occasional call from one group of men to another. It wasn't until midday that the low, steady hum of engines rolled in from the water. The first shapes appeared as faint shadows against the haze, growing clearer until several ships were visible. 2 large naval vessels, and several smaller craft moving in behind them. The men rose without needing to be told, forming lines that stretched down the beach. The ramps came down, and boarding began. Boots struck wet planks, gear clinked, and the ships began to fill. For a brief time, it almost seemed as though the evacuation might succeed uninterrupted. But the moment never lasted at Dunkirk. The growl of aircraft rose from inland, followed by the sharp descending scream of dive bombers cutting through the clouds. The first bombs fell into the shallows, sending massive columns of water and sand into the air. One of the smaller ships was hit squarely and split in two, sinking within minutes. Men pressed themselves into the dunes, or crouched low on the ramps, trying to move forward whenever there was a gap in the assault. The surviving ships pulled away under fire, their decks crammed with as many as they could carry. Those left behind drifted back to their shelters, some helping the wounded, others simply sitting in silence. Afternoon brought a damp wind that carried the scent of burning fuel and wet metal. Fires in the dunes smoked more than they burned, their heat too weak to push back the cold. The town loomed behind them, quiet but not empty. Now and then a glint or a brief flicker in a broken window betrayed a watchful presence. As evening came, the light faded quickly, swallowed by low clouds. The sea turned black, the white edges of the waves faintly visible in the gloom. The men settled into their positions, their rifles within reach, their eyes on the horizon. Somewhere in that darkness might be the next chance at rescue, or perhaps the end of the long wait. The night ahead promised nothing but cold, hunger, and the steady whisper of the tide. The 29th day began with a strange, brittle stillness. The wind had dropped completely, leaving the air cold but unmoving. The sky was pale, almost white, and the sea reflected it so perfectly that the horizon seemed to vanish. The tide was low, pulling the water far back, and leaving wide stretches of rippled sand where pools of seawater shimmered faintly. Wreckage lay scattered everywhere, splintered beams, rusted metal, torn lengths of rope, and the skeletal frames of boats that would never sail again. The men rose from their shelters slowly, their movements cautious, as if their bodies had learned to save every bit of energy. Hunger had stripped away the last reserves of strength, and thirst was a constant, pressing weight in their throats. Canteens hung light and useless from belts, some dented from weeks of use and abuse. Behind them, the town was dark against the washed-out sky, its broken buildings frozen in silence. Patrols no longer went far, it was too dangerous and yielded nothing worth the risk. The enemy was close now, close enough that some claimed to have heard the faint murmur of voices, or the metallic clink of weapons from the ruins. The first hours of the day passed in uneasy quiet. The men kept their eyes on the sea, scanning for the faint silhouettes of ships. It was late morning when the sound they had been waiting for finally came, the distant, steady hum of engines carried on the cold air. Shapes appeared on the horizon, faint at first but growing clearer. 2 large destroyers, several smaller craft, and a handful of fishing vessels pressed into service. The men moved toward the waterline, forming lines with a slow, deliberate precision born from repetition. The ramps went down, and boarding began immediately. Boots clattered on wet planks, orders were shouted over the sound of the tide, and the ships began to fill. For a few brief minutes, it seemed the loading might finish before trouble arrived. But then the now familiar growl of aircraft engines rolled in from inland, louder and closer than before. The bombers came low and fast, their dark shapes slicing across the pale sky. The first explosions hit the shallows, sending massive plumes of water and sand into the air. One of the fishing vessels was torn apart instantly, disappearing in a burst of fire and debris. Men ducked and scrambled, some pushing forward onto the ships, others throwing themselves into the dunes for cover. The attack was relentless but brief, the aircraft pulling away after a final pass. The surviving ships, their decks full, pulled away from the beach, leaving behind those who had not made it aboard. The rest of the day passed under the same pale sky, the wind returning in small, cold gusts that carried the scent of fuel and smoke. Fires burned low in the dunes, their heat too weak to drive back the chill. The town behind them stayed silent, but every man knew it was not empty. As night fell, the temperature dropped sharply, and frost began to form on the sand once more. The sea turned black, the white edges of the waves glimmering faintly under the stars. The men lay in their shelters, eyes fixed on the horizon, wondering if tomorrow would be different, or if it would be the same as every day before it. The 30th day began under a sky the color of lead, the clouds so low they seemed to press down on the beach itself. A cold wind moved in from the north, cutting through every layer of fabric and bringing with it the scent of salt and something faintly metallic. The tide was just starting to retreat, leaving behind long stretches of wet sand where the footprints of the night's watch still lingered, already half filled by the water. Wreckage lay in scattered heaps, broken lifeboats, the jagged remains of small craft, and twisted pieces of metal that had once been part of larger ships. The men emerged slowly from their dugouts, their movements heavy and deliberate. Hunger had reduced them to shadows of themselves, their eyes sunken, cheeks hollow, and every step measured to save what little strength remained. The thirst was worse, a constant ache that dried their throats and made their lips crack with each breath. Many no longer bothered carrying empty canteens. They were only a reminder of what they no longer had. Behind the dunes, the ruins of the town stood silent but watchful. Patrols reported the enemy was closer than ever. Movement seen in the open streets, the distant glint of metal in the pale morning light. The artillery had been active before dawn, shells falling close enough to send shockwaves through the sand. No one doubted the perimeter was shrinking fast. The first hours of daylight passed with no change. The men sat in small groups or lay flat in their shelters, scanning the sea. It was late in the morning when the sound came, a deep, steady hum that grew stronger with each minute. Heads lifted. Shapes began to appear on the horizon, emerging from the haze. Several large naval vessels, flanked by smaller craft, moving faster than usual. The air on the beach seemed to tighten. Men gathered their gear and moved toward the waterline, forming lines as they had so many times before. The ramps hit the sand with a metallic thud, and boarding began. Boots struck the wet planks, gear clinked and shouted orders cut through the wind. For the first time in days, the loading moved with a speed that hinted at urgency, as though those on board knew this was more than just another trip. But the danger was never far away. The distant growl of aircraft began inland, swelling into the roar of bombers. The first dark shapes broke through the clouds, moving fast and low. Explosions erupted in the shallows, geysers of water and sand rising high into the air. One of the smaller boats was ripped apart, vanishing in smoke and debris. Men kept moving, pushing forward in bursts, ducking only when the noise became unbearable. The attack was fierce but brief. The ships, perhaps anticipating it, began pulling away as soon as they were filled. The last ramps lifted, and the engines roared, driving them toward the safety of open water. On the beach, those who remained watched in silence as the vessels grew smaller, their wakes stretching out across the dark sea. The afternoon passed in a strange, tense quiet. Fires burned low in the dunes, their smoke trailing flat under the heavy clouds. The town behind them seemed darker than ever, and the faint flashes from within its ruins told everyone what was coming. As evening fell, the wind rose again, bringing with it a deeper cold. Frost began to form on the sand, glinting faintly in the last light of day. The men who remained lay low in their shelters, weapons within reach, their eyes fixed on the horizon. Somewhere out there, beyond the black expanse of water, was home. Whether they would reach it or not was no longer certain. But as the tide whispered in and out, steady and unchanging, they knew one thing for sure. The nightmare of Dunkirk was not yet over, and tomorrow they would face it again.